I want to return to our discussion of consequentialism and talk about some real-life cases. So let's just start by reminding ourselves of a couple of key ideas. First of all, consequentialism is the view that value depends entirely on consequences. Okay, so we look at the effects of actions, the effects of kinds of actions, of laws passed, of policies enacted, of a variety of things like that. What you take as basic there can vary from consequentialist to consequentialist. But the idea is that one thing, typically one action, is better than another if it has better effects. It has better consequences, or at least it tends to. And last time we talked about the difference between tendencies and the actual effects. So the idea is, well, an act is better if it tends to have better consequences. And so this is fundamentally a theory of better and worse, as we saw last time. It's really saying judge what's better by looking at the consequences. That means we have to have some measure of how good the consequences are. And in the classical theory, that means happiness, pleasure in the absence of pain, but it might mean all sorts of things. It might mean, in an economic sense, just economic growth, or trying to get people as a whole as well off economically as possible. It might be that we are interested in other kinds of specific measures in specific contexts. And so last time we talked about various variants of that, but the key was really to come to a method, which Bentham and Mill refer to as the moral calculus. So I want to return to that and think, well, if this is the general way of thinking about things, how do we go about making decisions? This is a theory that really starts from the idea that we begin in ethics by thinking about the practical problem we face. What do we do, and how do we go about deciding what to do? So we saw the general technique is this. We identify the options we have available. And then we identify the stakeholders, the people who might be affected by which action we choose. Most of the time, luckily, most of the world is not affected by what we do. And so in lots of cases, this is a very small list. But it might be a much larger list. If you're CEO of a large company, if you're a political leader, could be millions, even billions of people. Then what do? Well, we identify the outcomes that are possible. And here, notice we have to make some selection. Any possible outcome? Gosh, what if Martians invade? What if, this was supposed to sound remote, but now it doesn't sound that remote. What if some global pandemic breaks out and, a third of the population of the world dies? What if huge wars break out, et cetera? We've got to think, well, which of those are likely enough that we have to take them into account? And we'll come back to that problem because there are lots of issues there about how low the probabilities get before we can kind of safely ignore them, and what to do about the problem that's sometimes referred to as the problem of black swans, the really unlikely, unpredictable events that can suddenly happen. And there was no way to anticipate that one, though you could probably anticipate that something weird is going to happen. A black swan is called that because for years biologists thought all swans were white. They couldn't explain why. And then in a remote region of the outback of Australia, they found black swans. And so it was this completely unexpected event. So that's really what it means, just totally unpredictable, low probability, unexpected event. So we have to think about which outcomes we're going to take seriously, and that's an important step of the process. And then we have to think about the expected effects. For each of our stakeholders. So we have to think about the probabilities here, okay? And then on each outcome, well, what would happen to the various people who have a stake in this? And then we multiply by the probabilities. We get some expected effects. And then we take the balance of all of these, the balance of, well, you might say the benefits minus the costs. And that gives us some ranking of our various options. Well, part of what I want to do today is actually think through a few cases. Think through some classic dilemmas. Remember last time I said Bentham does have a number of arguments for adopting this approach to ethics. Now, some of them are very direct. He just says, look, he thinks this is what we do when we reflect on ethics. We think about possible effects. And so he just thinks really, whenever we're careful, we don't sort of leap to a judgment, but think through carefully. What do? We anticipate what would happen. And he says, that's just what this theory is telling you to do. What else does he say? Well, one argument is that this just agrees with our our sort of ordinary judgments. We think stealing is wrong. Why? Well, we think about the effects of stealing, and we think overall the effect is negative. We think murder is wrong. Why? The effects of it are negative. People are harmed. So those are arguments, but part of the argument too is that he says there has to be a common scale like this, where we compare goods, costs, and benefits of various kinds. And he thinks about some dilemmas. So I want to think about some dilemmas today, and some of these have been proposed as good illustrations of how to use this theory. Some have been proposed as objections to the theory. And I want to look in particular at that case from the book, the parable of the Sadhu, and see how we might think about that from this point of view. But let's take some super easy cases first. So last time we talked about the case from Plato, right, of the borrowed knife. So let's think about the case of the borrowed knife. You've borrowed this knife from a friend. You've promised to give it back when he wants it back. He comes to get the knife back, but it turns out it's because he wants to commit a murder with it. Now, what do you do? Well, first of all, we have to identify options. What are your options here? Good, you can give it back. Okay, so you return it or not, right? I mean, now, presumably, there are all sorts of different ways of not returning it. You could say, oh man, I lost it. Or you could say, dude, you're not in your right mind. Calm down. I'll give it to you after you've calmed down. Or you could say, oh, yeah, let me go look for it. And you waste a lot of time and, don't find it, quote unquote. There might be lots of different variants of that. But for now, let's group those all together. You return it or you don't. It's actually a pretty simple problem you're facing. So we've identified the options. Now, who's affected by this? Yeah.
Your friend and the guy who wants to murder.
Okay, good. There's primarily the friend and the potential victim. But of course, there might be lots of other people who would care about that potential victim. And you might be affected. How angry is this friend going to be at you? Is he going to take it out on you? So, we'll put you in there. Now, we have to think about the possible outcomes. So you return it. What are the likely outcomes if you return it? He kills the guy. Okay, right. So it seems like, yeah, I think I kind of know what's going to happen if I give him the knife back. He's going to go and kill that guy. That seems really bad. Now, of course, when he goes to confront the guy, maybe the guy will kill him instead. Or maybe he'll have a change of heart on the way over there. But it seems like, okay, yeah, I kind of know what the expected effects are going to be. What's the expected effect for the victim? Dead, right. So that's a pretty big negative consequence, right? What about the friend?
Jail.
Yeah, good. He's going to be in big trouble for committing a murder. What's the effect on you?
Also jail.
Yeah, probably for being an accessory to this murder and giving him the weapon. Quite possibly that, or at the very least, you're going to be in some trouble, right? And you're going to feel very guilty. So maybe jail, maybe just personal guilt, but you're going to feel pretty crummy about all that. Presumably, even if you don't like that other neighbor either. Now, suppose you don't. What's the effect on the friend? Well, yeah, I mean, he comes over wanting to commit this murder. You don't give him back the weapon. So what happens? What does he do? Good. Well, yeah, so maybe he finds another way. He thinks, okay, I can't use this knife, but hey, maybe I could borrow somebody's gun. Or, well, I do have that pickaxe. I can just, knock on the door with that or something. So it's not so clear, right? We sort of think, well, maybe he kills him anyway. So maybe it's jail anyway because he finds another way. But maybe not, right? Maybe he calms down. And we have to assign probabilities of that. We have to think about that. After all, if the guy has a huge knife collection at home, it's just that this would be particularly good, you might think, well, I'm not really preventing the murder by stopping it. I'm just making him use a slightly less desirable knife. Yeah?
What is the difference between identify outcomes and expected effects?
Good point. What's the difference between identifying the outcomes and then identifying the expected effects? What I mean here really is outcomes, what might happen, okay? So this is really like he might commit the murder. He might not, that type of thing. And what I mean by the expected effects is how that affects each of the stakeholders. So let's say what might happen? The outcome is he commits the murder. And now we think, okay, then how does that affect each person? Well, this one's dead. This guy is in big trouble and almost certain to get caught, so he's going to jail, etc. So this is just sort of the what might happen as a result, and then this is how that affects each person. How it might affect them, of course, we don't know because the victim's dead. Does the friend get away with it or not? You probably think, look, he's angry, he's going to get caught. But maybe he's a really good serial killer, and you think, oh yeah, this guy's probably going to get away with it. So we have to think about those options. Now, in this kind of case, you think, part of the reason I wanted to do a simple case is, yeah, I'm pretty clear on what's likely to happen here. But in a lot of cases where you're, let's say, making an investment as a business, you don't know whether this is going to work out or not. You decide to build that new factory. Are you going to sell enough of your product to justify that expense or not? You want to acquire some other company? Will that work out well for you or not? You know what? Well, part of it is, yeah, what might happen? You might not be sure at all of the outcome. You also might not be sure how that affects you, even if there is an outcome. Suppose you were suddenly to find out, I don't know, gosh, that two close friends of yours have a big fight and start hitting each other. How does that affect you? You might really not be sure until it happens. Yeah?
So is the return it or not return it the outcomes, and then everything listed below is the effects?
Well, this is really the option. This is like what your action is. You either return it or you don't. So this is what I mean by options. Then, what I mean by outcomes are, well, yeah, in this case, what I mean really is, yeah, he murders him, right? And in this case, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. So that's what I mean. And then the effects of each person we have to think through on that. So in some cases like this, it's so obvious what the effects are on various people, it's hard to even keep them separate in your mind. But in other cases where it's much less clear, then it's not so obvious. You think, gosh, maybe I should major in, blah, blah, blah field. Well, the option is major in, I don't know, philosophy or don't. And then you think, who's affected by that? Well, you, a few other people, not that many people. What are the outcomes of that? And then you might think, yeah, what are the possible outcomes of that? And then you think, how would that affect you? So what are the outcomes of that? I don't know. That's a hard thing to think about what the outcome is. But maybe it's more specific if we think about taking a specific course. And you can say, what are the outcomes? Well, do you do well in the course? What grade do you end up getting, right? Do you finish it? And so on. What might happen there? And then how much What are the effects on you? How much would you learn? How much would that benefit you or harm you as a result? I mean, maybe you take some course and it converts you into majoring in something that turns out to be a disastrous choice. Kind of like the guy who was written up in the Wall Street Journal years ago who went $50,000 in debt to get a master's degree in puppetry. I mentioned that example once when it was close to the time in class, and a guy after class came up to me and said, "Gosh, I'm a double major in philosophy and puppetry." I don't really recommend that as a career path, by the way. But hey, if that's your choice, okay. But you've got to think, well, what might happen as a result of that? How's that going to affect me? How's that going to affect my parents, who may or may not be happy about facing that debt along with me, and so on. Okay, well, let's get back to thinking about this. We think, yeah, he might go to jail anyway, or he might calm down. The victim, well, let's say, again, two options. Maybe he's dead anyway, if the guy decides to commit the murder by some other means, but maybe he lives. What about you? What are the effects on you if you say no? Yeah. Okay, maybe he gets angry at you, right? So maybe, now we do know you break a promise, no matter what. But now, maybe he kills you, so you end up dead. Maybe you just lose a friend. Maybe later, he thanks you and says, "Man, you know, you saved me from myself. I really appreciate it. I was going to do something stupid, and you stopped me. Thank you." You hope that's what's going to happen. Anyway, so we have to think about all those possibilities. And now to figure out the bottom line here, we have to think, okay, what are the likelihoods of those, and how good or bad are those effects? So we'd have to make some assessment. Now, ideally, we'd have to assign some numbers to this, but often it's pretty hard to do that. Still, suppose we say, yeah, dead. Let's just for fun count that as minus 100. Think of a life as worth 100 utility points. Then your friend goes to jail. Well, that's pretty bad for him. How bad is that compared to being dead? Yeah, it depends how long he goes to jail and what conditions are, but hey, he's going to be a murderer. He's going to go for quite a while in a maximum security prison. Let's say it's pretty darn bad. How about you? Well, hard to say exactly how negative it is. You're just an accessory here at worst, and they may not really prosecute you for this. Anyway, yeah, let's just say minus 10 for you. Add all those up, what do we get? Like minus 190. It's pretty bad. Now over here, it's more complicated because we're not sure what the odds are. So what are the odds this guy's going to kill him by some other means? We have to estimate the probability. And as you can see, that's going to be really hard. So there's several things that are tough here. One is assigning anything like quantities to any of this. But part of it is just, what are the probabilities? We often don't know. So what's the likelihood he's going to kill the guy anyway? Any guesses? Yeah, we're not sure. We might say 50% just because, hey, we're completely uncertain. So let's say that's a 50% chance. 50% chance he calms down. Well, that means for the victim, it's about a 50% chance of being dead, 50% chance of living. Now, what about what happens to you? Well, presumably, if the guy calms down, you're at worst going to lose a friend. But maybe he thanks you. Again, we don't know what the odds are. Let's just suppose, yeah, gosh, I don't know. What are the odds here? And also, suppose he does decide to kill the guy anyway. What's the likelihood he comes back and kills you too because he got mad at you? Who knows? Doesn't seem that likely, right? I mean, he's going to be mad at you, but mad enough to kill you? So you might think, well, maybe there's a 10% chance I'm going to end up dead. A 60% chance I'm going to lose a friend. Maybe then, what, a 30% chance he'll decide to thank me. So now I have to think, Well, how good or bad are all those things? And take some computation. And as soon as I start doing this, you realize this is kind of complicated. But on the other hand, the utilitarian is going to say, well, we have to do this all the time anyway. We make a judgment about what's most likely to happen. Now, next week, we're going to talk about problems here. And one of the problems is, A, we're pretty bad at making these judgments about probabilities. And secondly, even once we do, we're pretty bad about reasoning with them. We tend to ignore the low probability ones. And once somebody draws our attention to them, then we pay way too much attention.